Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. As you may or may not know, Melbourne is actually filled with a ton of awesome street art everywhere. Therefore, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to become one with it all. For that, all we have to do is sit ourselves down, take a deep breath, and just hold still for a moment. Oh, hi! Welcome back! Well, in this tutorial I want to show you how to create this really cool anamorphic effect where a three-dimensional object suddenly becomes a piece of art like it's been painted or projected onto the environment. You may have seen this effect used to create some funky online videos or explained by a half-human, half-robot, or maybe he's half-alien, called Captain Disillusion. In this tutorial though, I want to show you how to create this effect yourself, step by step, by using Mocha Pro from BorisFX. First off though, full frontal disclaimer, this video is sponsored by BorisFX. I really like working with their team and I really enjoy their software, and if you want to get into the fun, go and check out all of the awesome stuff they have on their website, and don't forget that you can use my custom coupon code SURFACEDSTUDIO in one word to get yourself 15% off the final price. But now I feel like I've sucked up enough of your time, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to the exciting world of Adobe After Effects. I have a new project set up here with a simple composition that just contains a single layer. On this layer I have a clip called tobiasstreetart.mp4, and this clip is just the beginning for this video, obviously without all of the visual effects added. As always, if you do want to follow along with this tutorial, simply go to my website surfacedstudio.com/downloads and you'll be able to grab this clip for free. Also, because we're going to cover quite a bit of ground in this tutorial, I'm going to drop you some timestamps down below so you can jump ahead to anything you might find interesting or anything you might feel you need a refresher on. But now, let's get started creating this anamorphic effect and projecting me onto the street so that Jimmy can run over my face. For that, let's simply apply the Mocha Pro plugin to the Tobias Street Art layer and let's launch Mocha. Now, the very first thing we need to do is we need to track the road, the street here, so that we can project me onto that surface. However, let's first create a simple shape to rotoscope myself out so I'm not affecting the track of the road itself. For that, let's scrub to the exact position where we want this anamorphic effect to kick in, then grab the spline tool, zoom in a little bit, and let's just draw a rough shape around my body. I'm going to rename this layer to Tobias Roto. And in the layer properties, I'm going to set the in point for this layer because we don't need to worry about this layer prior to this frame. Also, just a quick note, if your interface seems to be completely different, make sure that you're in the classic workspace. By default, you will probably see the Essentials workspace, so make sure you're in classic view so you can see all of the tools that Mocha Pro has to offer. But now, let's zoom back out and just track forward. Cool, that worked pretty well. Let's just adjust the shape of the spline after the camera has swung around to make sure that I'm always fully enclosed within this shape. Yep, and that should work. Let's return to the first keyframe, to where we want this effect to start. Let's zoom back out, let's disable the Tobias Roto layer, grab the spline tool, and let's create a shape for the floor. I'm going to draw a pretty large shape, including the area that I'm sitting on, but I'm very deliberately excluding the area where I know Jimmy will skateboard down because I don't want him to throw off the track. Let's rename this layer to ground and let's drag it below the Tobias Roto layer so that the Tobias Roto layer is going to be held out from the ground plane. In the layer properties, let's set the in point for this layer because again, we don't need to bother with all the stuff that happens before this frame. I'm going to enable perspective tracking, and I think I'll jack up the minimum percentage of pixels used to maybe around 60% as well. Let's enable the surface as well as the planar grid, and let's adjust the surface to give us an idea of what this ground plane looks like. It is a bit uneven, which is also why I made the shape a little bit bigger, but I think that should work. And let's start tracking forward. Obviously, I'm speeding these clips up just so you don't have to sit through it. And it's done. Let's check this out. And that actually looks like a really good track. Whenever you use tracking to insert visual effects into a shot, make sure that your track is absolutely rock solid. Otherwise, the visual effects will not sit well on the scene. They'll just slide around. But I think this actually looks really good. So once again, let's return to where all of our layers start. And let's create the actual projection. Let's actually project me onto the road so that I look like a piece of street art painted onto the ground. For that, I'm going to create a new shape into which we're going to insert an image of me sitting here. So it's going to be glued onto the ground. I'm also going to disable the gear icon on the ground. We no longer need to track it. So let's grab the X spline tool, zoom in a little bit, and let's create another shape. And now this looks almost identical to the Tobias Roto shape. And you may wonder, why aren't we just using that? It will make sense in just a second. Let's first rename this layer to Tobias Projection. Let's zoom out a little bit and let's adjust the surface to align it to the surface of the actual road where we want this projection to take place. And now here's the trick. With the Tobias projection layer in the layer properties, I want to change this link to track from Tobias projection over to the ground. So we're linking this layer to the tracking motion of the ground. So let's zoom out just a little bit. And now what's going to happen as I scrub through, can you see, well, let's disable the grid and the surface, it might be a bit easier to see. The Tobias roto layer follows me because it's just a rotoscoping shape, but this Tobias projection layer here is now kind of stuck on the ground. It's essentially projected from where I'm sitting outwards. The next thing we need to do, we obviously need to actually project an image of me into this layer or into this shape so that I'm essentially projected or painted onto the ground. For that, once again, let's return to the beginning of where we want this effect to start. And with the Tobias projection layer, I might actually also set the endpoint of this layer to start right here. And now we need to create an image that we can use to insert into our Tobias projection layer. And we want to use this frame right here where I'm sitting still. For that, let's come to the Remove module. And in the Remove module at the very bottom under Clean Plate Clip, let's simply hit Create to create a clean plate. Let's navigate to the tutorial folder, and obviously you can name this file anything you want. I always recommend leaving the frame name 171 in there so you know which frame this clean plate is for. Let's hit save. Then let's come to the clip module in Mocha Pro and let's import our clean plate right back in. In our import clip dialog, let's hit choose. Let's find the clean plate that we just exported. Here it is, clean plate input 171. Let's hit open and import. And this image has now been imported and it's called clean plate input 2. Let's now jump to the insert tab. And right now the preview window is still showing our clean plate input 2. So let's switch this back over to input so that we can see the actual footage. And now we need to insert this image into the shape that is being projected onto the ground. Again, it's really important. You need to be on the exact same frame that you created this clean plate for, which for me is 171. Then with the Tobias projection layer selected, in the insert module, let's change the insert clip from none over to clean plate input 2, which is exactly that image. Now, right now this doesn't help, but it's also because our surface is currently aligned to the surface of the road, and this is where the insert clip is shown. What we can do with the Tobias projection layer selected at the very top, we can select this button here to expand the planar surface to fill the entire frame. Let's hit this button. And now the surface is actually aligned to this particular frame, so the image, the insert clip, is over everything. And if you now scrub through, you can see this insert clip being distorted and essentially projected to the plane of this road going through the middle of the shot. However, it's also covering up everything else. We really only want to show this insert layer inside our Tobias projection shape. And in order to do that, in the insert module, you can either select to use all foreground layers, or over on the right hand side, simply drop this down and select the matte for the Tobias projection. So that is going to confine this insert to this particular shape. And now you can see I'm projected onto the ground. If you scrub through, you can see that from that point onwards, when this layer kicks in, I have a projection of me on the ground. Now, there are still two very obvious issues with this setup. One is that I'm still showing up underneath this insert layer, but also Jimmy is still underneath that layer as well, and we want him to ride over me just to add a little bit of realism into this effect. But let's address these issues one by one. First off though, I want to add a little bit of feathering to this projected layer. So let's select any of these corners, Ctrl A to select all of the vertices. Let's make sure you have the Uber key selected right here in the bottom right. Let's increase the edge width to maybe 20 or so, then hit set, and that's going to add a little bit of feathering around this projected layer. And it's going to blend into the shot just a little bit better. Make sure you disable the Uber key again, and let's first deal with me still peeking out from underneath this insert layer. Now, there's actually two ways to achieve this. The simplest way would be simply to reselect the Tobias projection layer and just extend this insert layer to essentially cover up anything that is peeking through underneath the bottom. This does actually work surprisingly well, except a little bit further away from the camera, where you may notice some misalignments on the lines along the concrete. Also, the insert layer itself is a little bit darker than the rest of the road, especially as the camera moves around, the lighting changes slightly, and the insert module doesn't compensate for that. So a much more solid, a much better way to solve this problem is to use the Remove module in Mocha Pro. Let me zoom back out and undo all of that, and let's go to the remove module. In the remove module, you won't see the insert anymore, but we're just concerned with removing me from this shot, at least the top part that isn't covered by this insert layer. And for the remove, our setup is actually already pretty good. I already have the ground plane tracked right here. Let's re-enable the grid so we can see that. And I also have the layer I want to remove, the Tobias rotor layer, already on top of the ground. So if I'm doing a remove, the foreground needs to be on top of the layers that you want to use to remove that foreground element. Let's just scrub through. So that actually looks all right. The one thing I might do on the ground plane, I might just adjust the shape a little bit and extend it so it covers the entirety of the road. Remember, we already did the tracking, so now we can do whatever we want with this shape, but the remove will only be visible within this shape, so I just want to extend this just a little bit. In the remove module, right now everything is grayed out because we have the ground, the bottom layer selected. Let's select the Tobias rotor layer because this is the layer we actually want to remove. Now everything is enabled. I'm going to change my illumination model from none to linear, so Mocha will compensate for the lighting shifts on the concrete as the camera swings around. And now let's simply render out this particular frame. And that looks pretty good. Now my bottom half is still visible because there is no frame in this entire clip where Mocha can actually see the asphalt underneath my feet, but all of the pieces that are left are actually confined to the contents of this insert layer, the Tobias projection layer, which we are going to replace anyway. So we just want to make sure that this overshoot is properly removed. And that does look pretty good. Let's just go back a little bit and just render out another frame just to double check that this remove is properly working. Yep, I think our setup for the remove should work. Let's one last time return to the track module. Let me switch over my preview from the remove, which we just rendered out, back to the input so we can see the entire clip, well, technically with the insert as well. Let's scrub forward. And now what I want to do is I actually want to rotoscope Jimmy because I want to overlay Jimmy on top of this projected insert layer. So it just adds a bit of realism to the scene, like I'm literally just projected and painted onto the ground. For that, let's zoom in a little bit, grab the spline tool, and let's just draw a shape around Jimmy's legs and the skateboard as well. For now, I'm going to deliberately exclude the shadow of the skateboard. We will deal with that in just a moment. I'm going to enable perspective tracking. Let's just track forward. Now, Jimmy will vanish behind the insert layer, so let's disable the visibility on the Tobias projection layer just so we can see what's going on. Let's just continue tracking for a little bit. And we don't need to track this all the way through. We just need to track far enough so that Jimmy is kind of past that insert layer, so that should be far enough. And finally, I'm just going to go through the tracked section and adjust the shape with some keyframes to make sure that we get a really nice, clean rotoscoping of Jimmy's legs as well as the skateboard. Now, it's clearly not the best rotoscoping job in the world, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I think this should work. Let's rename this layer to Jimmy Roto. Let's zoom in one more time. Let's grab the spline tool and let's create a little shape for the shadow of the skateboard. Let's rename this layer to Jimmy Skateboard and drag it below the Jimmy Roto layer. I'm going to change the link to track option on this layer to Jimmy Roto, so this shape automatically already follows the rotoscoping that we've done for Jimmy. Again, you may just have to adjust the shape just a little bit to make sure the shadow follows the skateboard as cleanly as you can. Cool, and with that we have everything ready to put together the final effect. I might just come to the beginning of these layers for the first keyframe for Jimmy's skateboard, set an in point. Let's come to the end and let's set the out point and do the same for the Jimmy Roto layer as well. Let's set the out point as well as the in point. It's just a bit easier. Let's re-enable the Tobias projection layer, save all of our data, and before we return to After Effects, let's quickly jump into the insert module, and you can see the gears are enabled on all of them. I actually really just want the Tobias projection layer to have that gear icon because that's the only layer we actually want to insert. And I also noticed that I missed to enable motion blur, so make sure you enable this option for any insert layer so they match the blur of the camera movement. Let's just jump into the remove module. And yeah, for the remove module, I actually want the Tobias Roto to have that gear icon. So in my insert, it's Tobias projection. In remove, it's Tobias Roto and nothing else. So with all of that, again, let's just save and return to After Effects to put together the final anamorphic effect. If you scrub through your clip, absolutely nothing will have happened because while we did all of our work in Mocha, we haven't actually applied any of the tracking or remove or insert data just yet. In Adobe After Effects, we now need to layer all of these different effects together to remove myself, then add the insert, and then add Jimmy and the skateboard shadow right on top. For that, let's return to the frame where we want the anamorphic effect to start. Remember, for me, that was frame 171. And I'm actually going to leave this base layer down here at the bottom. I'm actually going to start the remove rendering from here forward. So let's duplicate this layer. Let's trim it down and let's rename it to Tobias Remove. And now in the Mocha Pro plugin, let's expand the module renders. And the module I want to render onto this particular layer is the remove module. So let's enable to render a module, and let's change the module over to remove. And on this particular frame, you're not going to see anything at all. So let's jump forward just a little bit. And Mocha should remove at least the top part of my body in this shot. Cool, that worked pretty well. Obviously, my legs are still in the shot because Mocha never had a chance to look behind them and see what the ground would look like there. But let's add the insert on top. For that, I'm going to duplicate this layer. Again, let's rename this one to Tobias Insert. In the module renders, let's change the module from remove over to insert cutout. And while this now shows our projection on the ground, it also shows the rest of this projected plane, which just kind of looks a bit weird. If you come into the settings for the Mocha Pro plugin, expand the matte option and enable to view the matte. This is the matte that Mocha is currently applying to this layer, so it's showing much more than what we really want to see. So let's come into the visible layers and disable everything except the Tobias projection, because that is the only layer we actually want to use as a matte. Let's close this down. So this is the actual matte layer we want to use. So we just see the insert itself. Let's disable to view the matte. We're back to where we started. But now let's select to apply the matte. And there you go. You now have the remove at the bottom and the inserted projected layer right on top. Finally, let's place Jimmy onto Skateboard on top so he rides straight over my face to complete this anamorphic effect. For that, I'm going to duplicate this layer one more time. I'm going to rename this layer Jimmy Skate, expand the module renders, and I actually don't want to even render any module at all. Instead, let's expand the matte, disable to apply the matte. Let's pop open the visible layers. Now, once we want to see on this layer is Jimmy Roto and the Jimmy Skateboard. Let's disable the projection, so just those two layers are required to make this layer visible. Let's close this back down. And now let's select to create AE masks. And Mocha is now going to convert those shapes that we created and tracked into After Effects masks. With the layer selected, double tap M to reveal the masks and all of their properties. I'm actually going to trim this layer down to where the keyframes on the actual shapes are, because that's the only part I really care about. And just because the remove module does take a little bit to render, I'm just going to disable this Tobias remove layer for now. Obviously, I am going to show underneath this insert layer, but rendering will be a whole lot faster while I complete this final part of the effect. Let me disable the mask shape so we can see this a little bit better. So what I might do on the Jimmy Skateboard itself, I might actually give this just a little bit of feathering. I'm also going to rename the mask to Jimmy Skateboard Shadow, because that's really what it is. I'm also going to bring down the opacity to maybe 80% so the shadow looks natural on top of my face. I'm also going to add a little bit of feathering to Jimmy Roto, again maybe like 2 or 3 pixels, just so it blends together a little bit nicer. Let's rewind and play this back. And that looks pretty good. The only thing I'm missing is this really soft shadow that is trailing Jimmy and that is disappearing underneath this insert layer. Again, there's multiple ways to add this, but let's just do this nice and easy. So let's just create a new solid. I'm going to pick the color from the shadow underneath the skateboard and rename this layer to Jimmy Shadow. Let's hit OK. Let me trim down this layer to the length of our Jimmy Skate layer. Let's duplicate the Tobias insert layer, drag it to the very top, so that's just the insert itself. And on the Jimmy Shadow layer, I'm actually going to set my track matte from none over to alpha matte, so the shadow is only visible where the actual insert exists. Let's just come back to where Jimmy is about to skate over me. Let's just create a fairly rough shape that is trailing Jimmy. Let's enable the stopwatch for the mask path and make sure that this mask kind of follows along with Jimmy and his shadow. So if you now scrub through, you kind of have this mask trailing behind Jimmy, and it's kind of creating this shadow that will only exist while Jimmy is going over that insert layer. Obviously, it looks absolutely horrendous right now. So let's jack up this mask feather to maybe round about 100. Let's come back, and can you see right here, I want to make sure that that doesn't create an edge. So I'm actually going to bring down the opacity on this layer by a fair bit, maybe to around about 20-25%. I don't want it too bright, I don't want it too dark. I kind of want it just in the middle there so that the edge between the insert layer and Jimmy skating over it is almost non-existent. So now he kind of brings a little bit of that shadow across that insert layer and just looks a little bit more realistic. Now we can tweak the shape and the movement of the shadow a little bit to match Jimmy's soft shadow as best as we can. And with that, we are done. Let's zoom back out. Be sure to re-enable the visibility on the Tobias remove layer. Let's come back a little bit and let's play back our final anamorphic effect. And that's all there is to it. Be sure to check out the BorisFX website if you want to learn more. Don't forget to use my custom coupon code SurfacedStudio if you want to get 15% off. And finally, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.